It is spring, and unless you live on the East Coast, it is warmer. Trees are greener. Taxes are due. For Tech Republicans EDNet, I'm Dan Patterson with Choo Kim-Isgitt. She is the Chief Product Officer at EdgeWave, and today we're talking about cyber attacks during tax season and how to protect your sensitive data from those who might want to exploit tax season. Choo, thank you very much for your time today. I wonder if we could start by kind of defining the landscape. What types of cyber attacks should companies, whether they're SMBs, startups, or enterprise companies, expect during tax season?
Well, Dan, you probably know this, and starting really a couple years ago, we've seen an uprise in more tax-related attacks. A lot of them in the recent years have been focused around kind of starting as a phishing attack, right? So we've seen what's happening is these attackers will provide kind of an unassuming email. The emails have gotten more sophisticated and they sound more personable, they're more customized, and the taxpayer unknowingly will open a link or attachment in these scams, and then that will prompt them to, provide some type of sensitive data and or login credentials. Therefore, the bad guys are going out and actually, harvesting, data that they can use for, nefarious purposes, right? So that's probably the simplest form of that. What we've seen, I think, over the last year specifically, and I think the IRS has actually even broadcasted this last week. In fact, they've become more complex. There's a fairly new phishing scheme that's come out. It's already hit thousands of taxpayers around stealing taxpayer client data, right? So they take the tax filings. They're actually able to use that credential and that information to file fraudulent tax return, then going and by using the actual taxpayer's real bank account, depositing funds from that fraudulent tax return, and then at that point, going back to that taxpayer using a variety of tactics to solicit the tax refund that they unwillingly and knowingly received. And they're using a combination of techniques and mechanisms to do that. So it's not just phone-based, but it's email, it's fraudulent or malicious websites. They're getting more sophisticated around the different techniques that they're using to actually reach the individual and, provide or seemingly provide credibility to what they're actually asking the individual to do, right? In terms of giving up credential information, providing sensitive data. And in this case specifically, it's, you've received this tax return, you've got to now refund this tax return back, and it's actually being sent back to the original attacker of the whole scheme. So it's become very complex, and really both individuals as well as enterprises can easily fall victim to these, because now they've become more, in the eyes of the taxpayer, more credible because of the complexity of that phishing scam.
Yeah, and as we see by these attacks, humans remain an intractable cybersecurity challenge. Because businesses file during different times of the year, but businesses hold tremendous amounts of data. Of course, Equifax in 2017 is a great example. But are businesses targeted for exfiltration attacks that could help phishers or social engineers, those using pretexting, better target consumers?
The question around, are they better targets than consumers? I don't know that they necessarily are. I think consumers are more vulnerable to some degree because they don't have the security awareness training and other defenses, right, layered on top of that, if that's the question you're asking. I think for businesses, I think where they fall suit is that, at times they can be kind of distracted, right? If you look at phishing scams that come through in an organization, there may be scams that seem unassuming. Your current layers of security distract your IT organization. On the back end of that, right, there's some type of infiltration that comes in. And, in the last several years, we've seen a lot of these victimized enterprises where it's a waiting game, right? You've got the credentials, you've been able to surf around the network, you're waiting patiently as an attacker, and then you deploy your strategy. It's this very strategic move now. Who in HR, finance, other significant stakeholders in the company can you target, and then go and extract these information? And that's not only from a tax filing perspective, and like you said, because businesses file taxes at various times of the year, it's really just even general business, right?
So what about the federal government? What types of cyber attacks is the IRS likely to experience?
The federal government, I think really for them, one of the things that they hold, right, is they've got a huge database of actual information that the, hackers are looking for, the attackers are looking for. So for them, it's, do they have the right security, authentication, encryption around the data that they harness from, in this case, the IRS database, right? That's a myriad of information there that anyone would be very tempted as a bad actor to go and want to infiltrate. So for them, it's being able to secure that information as they transfer information back and forth from businesses and consumers. Do they have the right security in place to be able to protect the data, the client data that they have? And that's really, where I think their strongest, the ability to actually ensure that they've got the security layer is really what the IRS needs to be looking at.
EdgeWave Chief Product Officer Choo Kim-Isgitt, thank you very much for your time today. Last question for you. I wonder if you could help us forecast, say, the next 18 to 36 months in emerging cyber threats. It seems as though these simple human-based attacks, phishing and pretexting, continue to remain exposed vulnerabilities. What other types of attacks can we expect in the next 1.5 to 3 years?
I think the next 1.5 to 3 years will become more sophisticated in that we start seeing a more hybrid and or blended approach. I think you've seen it in the attack that we talked about earlier, but we'll continue to see that. I can foresee as specifically if we think about the example of the IRS and the what started off as kind of a phishing attack and blended into multi-technique attack. I think you're going to see more of that coming up in the future. One of the things that we can foresee is that because phishing is kind of the gateway to ransomware, and that's become a huge issue over the last few years, we can see, will that become a gateway for ransomware as we talk about IRS and taxpayer scams. And these blended attacks are what we're going to continue to see in the next foreseeable future, in the next 2 to 3 years, where it's not just simple phishing scams or spam or different typical attacks that we've seen where it's kind of one note. We're going to actually see a lot more blended attacks as we move forward in the next few years.